If the downing of flight MH17 is deemed an act of war, how does that affect the liability of Malaysia Airlines? Joining me to talk about the legal aspects of the crash is Floyd Weisner in Chicago. He's an aviation attorney at Weisner Law Firm and has experience representing clients in air crashes. And Floyd, your first piece of advice for the victims' families in determining their legal recourse, what would you tell them?
Well, Elaine, first I would tell them to get good, competent legal advice. This is a very complex, difficult area of the law, a lot of factors involved. Try to get the right advisors to advise them.
But how do you determine who's responsible? I know you spoke with my colleague Philip Yin on Biz Asia America recently that you think Malaysia Airlines is responsible. But what about the other parties that could be involved in all this? How do you go after a group or government if it is determined that they're behind the downing of the airplane, especially if it's deemed an act of war?
Well, you're absolutely right, Elaine. The obvious perpetrators of this criminal act are the people who fired the missiles and the people who trained them how to fire the missiles. Those are the ones primarily responsible. Problem is that's an international political problem, and it will have to be solved through political means or perhaps through the International Court of Justice in the Netherlands. That's going to be very difficult for the families.
So if you're a family member looking at all this, how do you know where to start? Do you wait for the investigation to end politically and then try to do what you can now?
No, that will take years. I think if they really need to act now, and the party they need to act against is Malaysia Air. And that's because under the Montreal Convention, which governs Malaysia Air's liability, Malaysia Air is responsible for all compensatory damages unless it can prove it took all necessary measures to avoid this loss. In my view, it can't prove that because it flew over this area, and therefore it's going to be responsible to pay these families damages. It can then perhaps assert a claim for indemnity from the governments involved, but it should pay the families first.
What kind of compensation are we talking about here? Could families receive a certain amount of money depending on who's responsible? And again, my question is determining all the different parties, but what kind of numbers are we talking about?
We're talking big numbers, Elaine. It's going to be several $100,000 on average per passenger, I believe, with certain people receiving more, unfortunately, based upon their citizenship. But it's going to be huge. It's going to be, in my view, $500,000 to $700,000 per passenger.
And is that going to be complicated by the difference of the international complications here?
Well, perhaps, but not much. And again, because the Montreal Convention has such a strict regime for liability of an airline, unless they can prove they took all necessary measures, that's very difficult to prove. And in my view, impossible in this case, then they're going to be liable. And so it doesn't really matter what happens later about who did what. They flew over that area when they really shouldn't have, and they're going to be responsible.
What court would oversee this? If you did pursue Malaysia Airlines first, who would have jurisdiction of that? And then when you go forward with the different countries that could be involved or the other parties responsible, the political part of this, who oversees that?
Right. Well, the Montreal Convention determines where you can bring a suit against an airline, too. And in this case, it's either going to be Malaysia or the place of ticketing, the place of destination, or the domicile of the person. So if I were advising families, I would not advise them to file a suit in Malaysia because it's a state-owned airline. I would advise them, if at all possible, to file suit in the other available jurisdictions. And as for the political course of action, that's going to have to take place, I believe, in the International Court of Justice. That's a whole different, more complicated procedure.
All right, Floyd Weisner, we appreciate you joining us from Chicago to help us break this all down.
Thank you.